as this week we look forward to the sixth Sunday of the ordinary time, and which will be really the last Sunday because next week we enter the season of Lent. The readings are from the book of Leviticus, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 44 and 46. The second reading is from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verses 31 and to 11, chapter 11, verses 1. And finally, the gospel is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. So if you think about it, all these weeks, we have still been in chapter 1 of Mark's gospel. And it is the story in chapter 1 that really is the subject of the reflection today, because it talks about the fact that Jesus cures a man who has leprosy. Now, the background for leprosy can be found in the book of Leviticus, which is the first reading for today, at least sections of it. The book of Leviticus, which, as you may know, is the third of the 5 books that make up what is known as the Pentateuch. And therefore, you have Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, and then Numbers and Deuteronomy. And it is generally known as a work attributed to the priestly tradition, because much of the concerns in the book of Leviticus have to do with ritual, with rites, etc. It is perhaps the book that many people, not most people, but many people, when they read the Bible, tend to pass over very quickly, because it gives a lot of legislation and kind of things that do not seem to be all that interesting. Now, in fact, the work that makes up the book of Leviticus begins in the last chapters of the book of Exodus and continues and winds up in the first chapters of the book of Numbers. So to say that everything contained that we're going to speak about is found in the book of Leviticus would be incorrect. You'll remember that the fact for the number of books really that make up the Pentateuch have to do with the size of the scrolls that were used to write the word. So what we believe is that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, were meant to be read as one great story. But since they ran out of space on parchment, they therefore had to get a new parchment, and that created a new book. It is known, Leviticus, as the priestly tradition, as I mentioned, and that would make it really a later writing in the Old Testament work. In fact, there is a strong theory that the other 4 books that make up the Pentateuch were edited by the priestly group and therefore kind of reflect priestly interests in the total of what is known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. Now, when we think about it, in the course of the 3 years, there are what we would call 156 Sundays of the 3-year period, not including the special seasons of Advent, Christmas, and Lent, Easter. And of those, so 156 Sundays in the 3-year period, of those, in the A cycle, 1 reading comes from Leviticus. In the B cycle, 1 reading comes from Leviticus. And in the C Sunday, no readings come from Leviticus. So it's interesting that this book, in terms of kind of being shared on weekends in our public gathering, only appear twice. And this week is one of those. Well, that's a little bit of a background of Leviticus, which develops what is sometimes known as the Holiness Code. And when one reads this book, one will also see a representation of the famous commandments, but in a little different way because the priestly community interpreted them in a little different way also. Now, the readings suggest, so this one reading chosen for this year comes from the 13th chapter of the book, and it has to do with the situation of what we call leprosy. Now, to begin with, and I'm sure this has been mentioned many times, the leprosy mentioned here is not Hansen's disease. In fact, the spread of Hansen's disease may have been influencing the world of Jesus by the time that he came to be, as many believe that Hansen's disease began somewhere in India a while ago, but it took time for it to infiltrate into the Middle East and into the culture of that Jesus was part of, but very, very few people actually had this disease. So, what is leprosy? Leprosy becomes a code word for any kind of skin ailments, whether they were permanent or temporary. And that's what the book of Leviticus deals with. Now, the section that we hear on Sunday leaves out, let me say, the more gory part or more medical part. Now, actually, the part that is included, that would be from verses 3 to 43. So see that there's a number of verses given over to this discussion. And so what does it include? Well, verses 1 through 8, and we hear part of that in this week, deal with swellings or scabs. Verses 9 through 17 deal with skin afflictions that are raw afflictions, things you can kind of see, and deal with what is called whiteness. Now, whiteness is not the color of the skin, but spots that appear on the skin, so white spots. Then verses 18 to 23 deal with boils. Verses 24 through 28 deal with burns. What do you do with burn situations? Verses 29 through 37 deal with the color of hair. So you can read all of this. It's very explicit and kind of interesting if you like these sort of things. Yellow hair was the sign of impurity. Black hair was considered to be the sign of ritual impurity. So we'll check some of you out to see. Remember, this is before the age in which they could dye and change the color of your hair, as some do, even in our own time. So that's the gist of the material that is left out from the reading this week, but that makes up chapter 13. So it deals with rashes, scabs, and pus, which are all possible expressions of the human body. Now, rashes, well, we all know what those are, occur as a bodily defense against toxins. So we learn a lot, really, kind of almost medically, from this particular section of the book of Leviticus. Scabs, of course, mean that the body is regenerating itself. Think about that. We know that. You have a wound, after a while you get a scab, and that means it's healing. See, so all of this, the book of Leviticus is not, however, interested in medical questions. It is more interested in what renders a person impure. And so it's all about purity and impurity. And in fact, even, it is not as concerned about the fact that some of these skin ailments could be contagious. That's true. There is some theory that certainly supports that, but that's not what is primarily the concern of the priestly tradition. What they are principally concerned with, what renders one impure. Now, impurity here also does not necessarily mean sin. We tend to equate the moral issue of sin as an impurity. Not to say that that isn't, but that isn't the concern here of this particular work. But if one, and it's pretty graphic here on what's to be done, if one were discovered to have one of these skin ailments, keep in mind even teenage acne could be considered to be a leprosy. Now, obviously that didn't last. And the role of the priest in this case is to be judges not of the physical quality, but of the impurity that was created because you had this kind of affliction. Although if you were declared impure, and this was the job of the priest now, is to declare whether or not they thought that the person was pure or impure. Because if you were impure, you were now excluded from the community. And here were the things that the book of Leviticus says you would have to do if you were discovered to be in this condition, namely having leprosy. First of all, you had to tear your clothes. So you could not wear your clothes nice. They had to be all messed up along with your hair. You had to mess your hair up. You had to cover the upper lip. And you had to act out. If you came near anybody, you had to call out, impure, impure, impure. So obviously, this was not a condition you liked, and what it did was isolate one from the community, because the theory was that if you came into contact with someone who was in the ritual state of impurity, you could also inherit that. So notice, though, there's an argument that goes on about this. It's not necessarily about the physical contagion, but it is about the contagion of impurity. So when the priest, therefore, received someone who was in this condition, they were not there to heal the individual and not to provide a prognosis, but rather, that is, about what medicine or sickness they had. That wasn't their job. So it would be false to think of the priests as really doctors here. They were, however, to be judges of the, and if you think about it, the moral state of the individual. So, therefore, and ritual impurity, which a person might be, was not necessarily, as I mentioned, sinful. Moral impurity was sinful. And there were certainly situations where this would be true. Moral impurity, if you engaged in idolatry, incest, murder, obviously things that seriously affected the good health of the community, and notice that's what all of these different actions would be, would render you morally impure. But what we're talking about here with leprosy generally was ritual impurity. And all of that is what is the background for this reading, but I give a little bit of the kind of diagnosis, if you want, of leprosy as it was perceived, not only back in the time in which the book of Leviticus was written, probably sometime around the beginning of the 6th century before the Common Time. So sometime in the late 500s before the Common Time. As I've mentioned at our beginning here, we believe that this was a group known as the priest who contributed the material that makes up the first 5 books called the Pentateuch, and we also suspect that in some ways they also doctored up the material that went into the other 5 books. So, for example, the opening chapters of the book of Genesis is a story of creation in which God creates the world by speaking, in 6 days. We're all pretty familiar with that. Remember, God looks over the chaotic waters. God says, let there become order out of things, and day and night, and are all created by God's word. Well, what's important to notice here is these would be concerns that the priestly group would be interested in. And so we believe, and as you probably know, there are 2 stories of creation. Those of you who have not checked this out, here's an opportunity. Chapter 1 gives the first story, and chapters 2 and 3 give a different story of creation, which is probably much older than the first story. So interestingly, you might think the first story was written first. Not the case. But anyway, all of that is to say that it's a good example of the priestly influence in the material that appears in the Pentateuch. So here, the issue then was whether or not a person was in a state of impurity, that is, ritual impurity or not. And if and when one recovered, so for example, one had some kind of skin affliction, and it was healing, and finally the scab went away, and kind of you said, oh, I guess it's gone. Now you had to go back to the priest for him to judge whether or not you were ready to re-enter the community. You thought it would happen overnight? No. What he would do is send you home for a week. Sounds like modern tests, doesn't it? Would send you home for a week, then you had to come back again, and he would recheck to make sure that it really was gone. And then you were declared pure, and you could rejoin the activities of the community. Now, when you think about it, isolation was really the most horrible thing about leprosy and stories connected with it. What it did was separate you from being able to live even with your own family. You were expected, and that's why those who were discerned as having leprosy had to often go outside of the village where they lived. Consequently, they also lived with others who might have been suffering from similar afflictions. And if there was the possibility of contagion, you can see this only aggravated it and called it to happen. In fact, in many villages, there was a well, of course, which was in the center of the village. But for those considered to have leprosy, there was also a well out of the village where they could get the water that they needed in order to survive. So this whole issue got kind of involved as it would develop over a period of time. And obviously, as the priestly group, who, as I said, wrote this in the later part of the 500s before the Common Time, the Israelites had settled in the land, and so they were pretty much settled in sense of practices and customs. So all of that is background for the gospel. So now you have a man who comes to Jesus. Now, this is interesting because this man, a little differently, remember all in chapter 1, we've had a number over the last couple of weeks, a number of kind of incidences where Jesus had driven out the demoniac, where Jesus had healed the sickness from Peter's mother-in-law, where he was pictured as doing a number of other healings. Remember, at the end of the day, they came bringing their people to the doorstep where Jesus was, and he healed many. This now seems to be a kind of addenda to the first chapter, where a unique kind of healing takes place. In the first instance here, it is a man who asks Jesus. He comes up to Jesus, kneels before him, and says to him, "If you can do this, would you heal me?" And Jesus responds. Now, it's a little bit interesting on how the reader of this text will make it. Could say, well, yeah, I can do it. Or, what do you mean, if I can do it? I mean, there could be a little emphasis that the man with the leprosy is challenging Jesus as to whether or not this power that he claims as he has received from God, he is really able to use. So it's a little different curing here than the ones that we have seen thus far in Mark's story. Well, and there's an interesting, leprosy, by the way, the very word itself means a striking down or a laying low. Well, you can see any one of these afflictions or illnesses might be doing that to a person, but most importantly, again, not to reiterate too often, most importantly, what it did was to exclude one from community life. And that isolation can certainly, when you think of it, and I suspect that as we live in this COVID period, there are some who have really felt this more, unable to be visited by friends, kind of having, although we have modern communication and that certainly changes things, but unable to maybe either go out or have people come in. So that was the whole difficulty, really, of this particular ailment or disease. So, can I do it? Now, there is an interesting response that is made here where Jesus is said that he was moved with pity, or other translators have, he was moved with compassion, or one translation of the Bible, which I don't encourage, what do you think I can do it, that I can't do it? Well, but another translation, and this is interesting, one word here in this little episode gets different translations, is that rather than saying Jesus had pity or compassion, Jesus was angry. Now, what is he angry at? Is he angry at the question that was posed to him by the leper, or was he angry at the illness itself? Is that where his anger was? Well, many translations do not use that one. Perhaps the most popular and the one that we're suggesting here, although I think the one we use on the weekend is with pity, but is better translated with compassion, which is certainly the quality that Jesus very often shows. So he now heals the man and tells him, please don't tell anybody. Keep it a secret. We've mentioned before this whole quality of secrecy, but it may well be twofold that Jesus did not really want to be exclusively known as a healer, but rather wanted to be known as a proclaimer of the kingdom message. The kingdom of God is here, is at hand. That was the emphasis, certainly, that Jesus would make as he tells, or rather as his story is told in the book of Mark. So, as I said, this healing, or better, I suppose, could be called a cleansing, because really what Jesus is doing is allowing the man now to return back to ordinary life with the community. But even Jesus kind of respects the law here by telling the man that he needs to go, and he will do this a couple of times, go to the priests and let them make the decision. Because after all, no matter what Jesus did, it didn't count if it didn't have the blessing of the priestly group, okay? And so they were the ones who determined, yes, you are cleansed, yes, you are healed, yes, you can return to the community. He sends the man who is healed, as you remember at the end of the story, will find that he would like to join Jesus' group. He is certainly very happy for what has happened to him, but Jesus instead says, no, go and take this message back to your family. In fact, the leper becomes, that is the healed leper here, becomes a missionary. He is to take the word, the news of Jesus. That is his mission. That's what Jesus would like him to do. This particular incident, of course, reinforces and reasserts Jesus' authority. Remember that he is operating not as the scribes do, but rather with a new kind of authority. And again, this illustrates part of the message that Mark sees Jesus as doing, as bringing something new into the mix. So I want to just kind of finish with the fact that isn't this important little notice in this episode, the humanness of Jesus. Jesus, of course, is angry. Now I know, how could Jesus get angry? We get angry, but certainly not Jesus because he's divine. Again, the divinity of Jesus is important, and he operates with the power of God. Well, having the power of God is not the same as trying to define divinity, but certainly there is an important connection here. But Jesus' humanness, that he is challenged. And I suspect none of you are ever challenged, but do you think you can do that? Who do you think you are? Have you ever had those kind of people come to you? Or have you ever done those to others, saying, who does she think she is that she can do that? Where did she come up with that? Well, that's Jesus' reaction, and that's why the word angry, although it is not brought into the translation we'll hear this weekend, may be more correct, that Jesus shows a humanness here. What do you mean? The power of God is at work in me, and in this case, of course, he can. I can, rather. So, an interesting characteristic of the Markan story, and I just mentioned this again in passing, is that from time to time, Mark points out the humanness of Jesus, like us. Jesus has feelings. He will be angry. He will be disappointed. He couldn't do anything, we'll see later on, because there was a lack of faith on their part. They didn't believe me. So at the same time that we tend to always see, well, Jesus, of course, is divine, he's also very human. And the gospel writers are interested in kind of making sure that that quality is also brought out. So this brings us now to the end of chapter 1 of Mark's story. We will not be returning to the sequence of Mark's story until the 11th Sunday of the year, which this year will be June 13th. So we are taking a hiatus from the story of Mark, at least in continuing each week to take some little section. And when we pick him up again, we will be picking him up in chapter 4. So chapters 2 and 3 of Mark's story will not be part of the regular discussion that we have. Now, having said that, let me point out that next Sunday already you're going to say, oh, we're back to chapter 1, and we will be. We'll see an episode of Jesus in the desert. So as we go through now the special section of the Lent Easter cycle, there will be some sections from Mark, but only occasionally. And so for the mainstream, this will be our last time for a while of listening to Mark's story. In concluding, I have overlooked the second reading, which, as you will notice over the last 6 weeks, has come from the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, a very important letter, a long letter that deals with many issues, and really did not find that we had sufficient time to analyze this work. So at some time, probably when we come back, hopefully in the fall or summer, we'll have an opportunity to look again at this very important and interesting letter of Paul, the first letter to the Corinthians. Perhaps just as we leave off here, one of the most important chapters in 1 Corinthians, which we have not heard, is chapter 15, which is the chapter in which Paul articulates the visions of the risen Jesus that he has had and makes the case that Jesus is truly risen. So I did not mean to overlook 1 Corinthians, but merely because of its importance and significance, really didn't have appropriate time to deal with it. But for now, let us hope that the healing gifts of Jesus continue to be at work at us this week, but throughout the season now that we will be entering into next time. And I would be amiss if I did not wish a happy Valentine's to all of you who are watching on this day. Thank you. Hope to see you again.